So, we have Neil Armstrong has stepped onto the surface of the moon, first man to do so. Buzz Aldrin right behind him becomes the second. Where's Michael Collins during this time? Up in the atmosphere of the moon. Okay, here's what took them about 7 minutes to kind of get organized after they stepped on the moon. So they got on the moon and kind of got themselves oriented. They got themselves organized. And these are the things they did after they got on the surface of the moon and got themselves organized. Armstrong, number one, took a soil sample, tucked it in a bag, and put it into his pocket, which was in his right thigh. Okay? So Armstrong takes out a bag, he gets a sample of the moon's surface, a soil sample, puts it in a bag, and secures it in the pocket that was in his right thigh of his astronaut suit, so to speak. So Armstrong collects a soil sample, tucks the bag into a pocket on his right thigh. Second thing that happens is Armstrong removes that TV camera, remember that he mounted on the lunar module as he was getting out. He grabs that camera and he made a panoramic sweep of the area. So he took the camera out and just did a panoramic sweep of the area. So people in back Earth could see, what they were seeing. So the second thing that happened is Armstrong removed the TV camera that he had attached to the lunar module on the way out and then made a panoramic sweep of the area with the camera. Third thing Armstrong did then is he mounted that camera on a tripod, about 68 feet from where the lunar module was sitting. So the third thing he did is he took the camera, mounted it on a tripod about 68 feet away from the lunar module. And what he pointed at? Them. No, them, and what they were doing. Okay? And I think it might have been Carolyn that said this the other day. The fourth thing they did is they planted a specially designed American flag on the lunar surface in clear view of that TV camera. And where are they going to broadcast all this to? Back to Houston at NASA and Earth. Yep. So Armstrong collected a soil sample, tucked it in a bag inside the pocket on his right thigh. Armstrong then removed the TV camera from the lunar module and made a panoramic sweep of the area so people could see kind of what they were looking at. He then mounted the camera on a tripod 68 feet from the lunar module, pointed towards those, and then Armstrong and Aldrin planted that specially designed American flag on the lunar surface in clear view of the TV camera. By the way, what do you want to mean by specially designed flag?
Made out of metal.
No?
The flag had a frame that went off at the top at a 90-degree angle because there's no wind,
right.
So it wouldn't be held up.
Yeah, the frame was metal, but they made it at a 90-degree angle because obviously it just would have gone limp with no wind. They wanted to see the American flag, so it was actually put on a stand almost so people could see the flag. Okay? Well, guess who spoke to the astronauts through a telephone radio transmission at that point? President Richard Nixon. Okay? President Richard Nixon then spoke to the astronauts. He was seeing what they were doing live.
That's number 5.
No, yeah, that's number 5. Yeah. Nixon then spoke to the astronauts through a telephone radio transmission. Now this is not number 6, but he described his conversation with the astronauts as, quote, the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. Okay, so Nixon speaks to the astronauts through a telephone radio transmission, and he describes his conversation with Aldrin and Armstrong as, quote, the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. Now, Nixon had originally planned a pretty long speech to read during this phone call. He was going to get into length when he was talking to the astronauts. And Frank Borman, who was at the White House during this time, convinced Nixon to keep his words brief. So Nixon had kind of a long, drawn-out speech he was going to give to the astronauts during this time. And Frank Borman, who was invited to the White House, remember he flew Apollo 8 that set this up, and turned down the opportunity, remember, to be actually Neil Armstrong, he convinced Nixon to keep it short. Anybody want to know why? Anybody want to know? You all want to know. Anybody know why? Why do you, what? No, it doesn't have to do with jealousy, it has to do with respect. he didn't think Nixon should be hogging and making a big long speech because whose idea and vision was this? President Kennedy's. So Borman asked Nixon to respect the lunar landing as part of President Kennedy's legacy rather than his. You know, don't make this look like it was your idea. Please keep your comments brief and give credit to the person whom credit belonged to, who was the man that said he had a vision that by the end of the decade we would land a man on the moon and returning safely to Earth. That was President Kennedy. And Nixon actually responded well to that and decided to keep his remarks short. Well, after this happened, Armstrong, this would be number 6, I guess, right? Armstrong and Aldrin continued to walk the moon's surface collecting rock samples. And things were, this is not a new one, it's just part of this. Since things were going so well for the astronauts during that walk, Mission Control actually gave them a 15-minute extension to walk on the moon. They gave them 15 more minutes to walk than they had originally planned for, because things were going so well. So since things were going so well for both the astronauts during the moonwalk, Mission Control gave both of them a 15-minute extension on the moon's surface. By the time he was done, Armstrong had actually walked 65 yards away from the lunar module, which they didn't think would ever be maybe possible. 65 yards is more than half a football field. So Armstrong actually got as far as 65 yards away from the lunar module during his moonwalk. And then what did they do? Number 7 is they re-entered the Eagle. Okay, they went back into the lunar module. Now, Aldrin actually entered Eagle first. He went in first. And why did he go in first? And what was he waiting for? What was he going to help with? What are 2 things that they needed to get into the lunar module? The rock samples, 2 boxes of rock samples, and the film from the camera. Okay? So Armstrong and Aldrin lifted 2 sample boxes into the lunar module hatch, and then also they put the film from the camera in there. Okay, then Armstrong said to Aldrin, remember that bag of memorial items? Toss those down, things they were going to leave on the moon. Okay? Okay, so they tossed down and left some items on the moon, which I'll tell you about in a bit. So once those memorial items were tossed down, Armstrong climbed into the lunar module, and both astronauts are back where they're supposed to be. So what are they going to do next? They're going to dock back up with the command module. So before they did that, they had to lighten the load for their return to lunar orbit. So what type of things did they throw out on the moon's surface? Those backpacks that they had trouble getting through the door, they threw those out. They have almost lunar overshoes. If you've ever seen pictures of them, they look like great big moon boots. Huge Uggs, right? They threw the camera out and any other unneeded equipment. So anything they didn't need to get back up to dock with the command module, they tossed out because they wanted to get rid of that weight. Well, they pressurized the LEM, in other words, got oxygen running in the LEM, settled down to sleep. Now this is kind of an interesting story. The inside, you can see these circuit breakers when we get to the National Air and Space Museum, because they have the instrument panel for you from that mission that you can see. There's all kinds of circuit breakers and switches. Well, there was a circuit breaker that would be used to arm the main engine that would lift the lunar module up into the orbit to dock with the command module. There was a circuit breaker. While they were moving around inside the cabin of the LEM, they accidentally broke that circuit breaker switch off. And if they can't start the engine, they can't get off the moon. Okay? So they're in a bit of a panic. because that would prevent firing the engine, which would strand them on the moon. So they accidentally broke off the circuit breaker switch that would arm the main engine to lift off. You know what Armstrong used to activate the main engine switch? Felt tip pin. He had a felt tip pin, and he pushed it in there and wiggled it and got it to fire the engine. But I'll bet you that was a little bit nerve-wracking. So finally, a felt tip pin was sufficient to activate the switch after they broke the circuit breaker switch. So they activated the engine. They slept about 7 hours. Mission Control woke them up. And they lifted off toward the command module and docked. Okay? Now here are the things that were left on the surface of the moon. Remember I told you? Here's some things that were left. We know the one thing that was left was the memorial bag, right? And inside that bag, it had a gold replica of an olive branch as a traditional symbol of peace. So they threw out a memorial bag which contained a gold replica of an olive branch as a traditional symbol of peace. What else did they leave on the surface of the moon? Although it blew over as soon as they took off. The flag. They left that American flag, obviously. They also left an Apollo 1 mission patch. Why?
Hold on, I'm sure.
What's that?
Was it on the bottom of the module?
I would think Apollo 1 mission patch.
Because that was what paved the way.
Those were the astronauts that, remember, lost their lives on the launch pad in the fire, and as a memorial to those astronauts who were going to pave the way for the Apollo moon landing, they left their mission patch on the surface of the moon. They also left Soviet medals that were commemorating who? Think about it. Come on, make my day. They left Soviet Yuri Gagarin. Very good. They left Soviet medals there that would commemorate cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. They gave Yuri Gagarin his due as a guy that was a space pioneer. So they left Soviet medals that commemorated his flight accomplishments.
How do you spell his name?
Y-U-R-I is Yuri, and G-A-G-A-R-I-N, Gagarin. G-A-G-A-R-I-N. They also left a diamond-studded astronaut pin from Apollo 1. A diamond-studded astronaut pin. Who would get a diamond-studded astronaut pin? Who would get those? What? The wives of the astronauts of Apollo 1 were all given a pin before their husbands were scheduled to go up. This pin was given by the widows of Apollo 1 after the funerals of the fallen astronauts. They gave their pins, and one of those pins was left on the surface of the moon after Apollo 11. So a diamond-studded astronaut pin from Apollo 1 that belonged to one of the widows of Apollo 1 astronauts. You know what the kind of cool thing they left? They left a piece of wood. What was that piece of wood from? Pretty old piece of wood. About 1903 is when it was in existence. What?
Presidential desk?
No?
Like
Ship,
a
wasn't
U.S.
it?
What?
A ship.
Close. Kind of a ship. Think about what we're doing. We're flying in space. We're landing on the moon. What was this piece of wood from in 1903?
Wright flyer?
The Wright brothers airplane. It was from their left propeller. A piece of wood from the Wright brothers' left propeller, and they also, the fabric that made up the wings was also left there. So a piece of fabric from the wing of the Wright brothers plane and a piece of wood from its left propeller was left on the moon. And the final thing I gave you a copy of, pull it out here, is this. They left a plaque which was mounted on the LEM ladder when they first went down. And this plaque had a drawing, 2 drawings of Earth. You can see that. The western and eastern hemispheres. Yes? Did you not get one of these? Anybody else not get one? Shows you the western and eastern hemispheres of the world. right? Okay, it has an inscription on there, and it says, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind," and it had the signatures of all the astronauts and Richard Nixon. Okay, that was left on the moon. And it was actually placed on the leg of the LEM and was taken off and left. Okay? All right, well, after rendezvousing with Columbia, the LEM was jettisoned into orbit. Okay, because what happens is it docked like this again, only you didn't have this part, did you? All you had was this part. Okay, and so they docked and made themselves back into the Columbia, and then they jettisoned the LEM into lunar orbit. They just shot it out there. Where did it end up being, you think? Where did it end up? Ended up on the moon somewhere, because it caught the gravity of down. Okay? Well, on July 24th, 1969, the astronauts returned home. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, east of Wake Island in the Pacific, and were recovered by the USS Hornet. So on July 24th, 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts returned home. They splashed down in the command module Columbia in the Pacific Ocean, just east of Wake Island in the Pacific, and they were recovered by the USS Hornet. So, NASA backed up the promise of President Kennedy they made in 1961 to land a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. July 24th, 1969. Almost, he said, within the decade, barely made it, right? Now, the Columbia command module is in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and you will have an excellent opportunity to see that. Okay? When we get there. All right, any questions? Okay, what we're going to do then is we're going to move on to the third event, 1969, which was the Manson murders from August 1969. I don't know how far we're going to get, but we're going to get an introduction to it today, and then I'm going to make you copies of my notes, and you can have that information for your notebooks. And Tuesday we are starting the 1960s. Okay? So I just want you to have this information. Okay? Now, what I really want you to do, now that I think about it, if I can trust you to do this, wouldn't you rather me just give you the notes and you listen?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that, okay? But I'm going to give you the notes, but you got to listen, okay? You can't be distant and not paying attention. Okay, so put everything away, and I'm going to tell you about the Manson murders, and you don't have to write anything down, which means I can go further, right? And I'll give you a copy of it before we're done here. But I want you to really listen to this thing. You might want to have your ID sheet out just so you can maybe see what some of these names I'm talking about, just so you can see. But what happened in August of 1969, the evening of August 9th, in Beverly Hills, California, an actress by the name of Sharon Tate and 4 of her guests were just brutally murdered at her home. Brutally murdered. They were shot and stabbed to death in a series of brutal and bizarre murders. The victims included Abigail Folger, who was 25 years old, a very wealthy coffee heiress. You ever heard of Folger's Coffee? Wojtek Frykowski, who was her male companion. Steve Parent, wrong place at the wrong time, 18-year-old friend of the property caretaker who was shot in his car while arriving to visit the caretaker. And a guy by the name of Jay Sebring, who was the top men's hairstylist in the United States. He was one of the first people to develop men's hair products. In those days, men didn't spend a lot, that wasn't a big deal. But he was a men's hairstylist, one of the most famous in the world. Now, if you can imagine this murder scene, Folger was stabbed 28 times. Parent was shot 4 times with a .22 caliber revolver. Sebring was shot once and stabbed 7 times. Frykowski was shot twice, stabbed 51 times, and hit in the head repeatedly, they estimated 13 times, with the butt of the revolver. Miss Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was stabbed 5 times in the chest and back, and 11 more times to various parts of her body. A nylon rope was wrapped around her neck, which left rope burns and extended over a rafter in the ceiling. So she had a rope around her neck while she was laying down, and there was a rafter, and the rope was over the rafter as if they had maybe even tried to hang her. Okay? The other end of the rope was tied to Sebring's neck. In addition, her unborn son died in the murder. Folger and Frykowski were stretched out on the lawn of the estate, while Parent was slumped over in his car in the driveway. He actually was the first victim of this unbelievable crime. The victims at the Tate residence were stabbed a total of 102 times during this brutal killing spree. No weapons were found at the scene, but the killers did leave a calling card. They wrote the word pig in Sharon Tate's blood on a door. The bodies were discovered by an employee of the Tates the next morning, who immediately called the police, and the lone survivor of this murderous action was that caretaker I talked about that took care of the grounds. His name was William Garrison. He was just 19 years old, and lucky for him, he was asleep in a boarding house that was separate, and the murderers never really realized or got to him. But his friend, who came to visit him, got the brunt. Okay? Well, who became an instant suspect after they interviewed Garrison? Yeah, instant suspect. They later arrested him for murder, but he was eventually set free because they didn't have any evidence that he really was involved. Mrs. Tate, who was pregnant, obviously had a husband. Her husband was a movie director by the name of Roman Polanski. Okay? You've heard of Roman Polanski maybe. He was out of the country during the murders filming. He since then has had a lot of problems with having sex with underage women. And he's actually in London right now because there's an arrest warrant out for him to this day. And he stays in London, so he can't be prosecuted. But that was after this thing, okay? Well, what do you think the rumors surfaced? What were the killings as a result of? When they first found him and said, oh, this is obviously because of a